Howdy. It's election year in the United States, which means dread. It's looking particularly dire. I know people say that each election year. The reason why I think that this election year is particularly harrowing, other than the foreshadowing in particular states, Florida, is because they have released a document 920 pages long called The Mandate for Leadership under Project 2025. This is a document where each paragraph you read takes another year off of your life. I'm only going to summarize and commentate on the foreword of the document, which only gets us to page 50. If you want future parts of this where I summarize and or pick out important things from this document to warn you about, I'd be happy to do so. But we're only doing the foreword for today because I think it encapsulates the general problem. And I mean, that's what a foreword is to do, really, to set your goals. And then the rest of the document is to further expand on those goals. This Project 2025 document is written by many people, lots of people. This introduction and or foreword we're going to go through is written by Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, which is a research and educational institution whose mission is to build and promote conservative public policies based in Washington, D.C. Very cool. He has a PhD and he's taught in the University of Texas. He's taught in a K-12 Catholic school, and then he became the president of the Wyoming Catholic College. I feel like this is particularly ironic given some of his complaints in the original foreword, which we'll get to later. But I thought I'd give you some background so you know who this man is. Kevin Roberts starts off this foreword with a pretentious rant about how transgenderism, communism, and wokeism has destroyed the United States. I particularly wanted to read this quote because I found it a little bit funny. Contemporary elites have even repurposed the worst ingredients of the 1970s radical chic to build the totalitarian cult known today as the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. How am I supposed to take this man seriously when he uses terms like the Great Awakening? I need conservatives for 4 seconds not to act like satire of themselves. We can't even satirize you anymore because you've made it real. Anyways, in this introduction to the introduction, he references the weak state of conservatives in the 1970s and how conservatives fixed this by writing a mandate for leadership, which is a different long-page document that is a call to action, and then putting Ronald Reagan in, the presidency in 1981. This part of the introduction is foreboding to me, considering when I meet Ronald Reagan in hell, it'll be with a baseball bat and bear spray. Roberts then continues to establish 4 main goals for this document and for the transition. Number 1, restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. Number 2, dismantle the administrative state and return self-governments to the American people. Number 3, defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. And number 4, secure our God-given individual rights to live freely, what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. And then he continues to broadly discuss each of these points, to which I will summarize. Promise number 1. Restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. Roberts starts off this section by stating that the next U.S. president should make, the nuclear family and reinstating the nuclear family as a priority, as if that ever stopped being a thing. I am just going to read a quote directly here because I found it goofy. The name real people give to things we do together is community, not government. Our lives are full of interwoven, overlapping communities, and our individual and collective happiness depends upon them. But the most important community in each of our lives and the life of the nation is the family. I don't even disagree with the first part of that paragraph. What is absolutely batshit to me about this part of the writing here is that they imply the nuclear family is like the cornerstone of community. The nuclear family is the antithesis of community. The phrase, "it takes a village," exists for a reason. Having a nuclear family unit, patriarchal in nature, where one man has control, complete control over one adult woman and maybe several children, is not a marker of community. That is patriarchy in action. Children only legally having two adults they can, depend upon financially, and those adults having all that legal, claim over them as if they're property, and those adults likely, knowing conservatives, not allowing other adults to engage in parenting like they are engaging in that parenting, is not community. A secluded nuclear family in a cushy little suburban single-family home is not community. If you were to ask an anarchist what community is, I believe conservatives would shit their pants. He says, "Today, the American family is in crisis. 40% of all children are born to unmarried mothers, including more than 70% of black children." As if the conservatives give a flying fuck about black people. The man you were praising, Ronald Reagan, earlier in this passage, literally planted crack in black communities so he could arrest them en masse. Do not act like you give a fuck about black people. They always say that leftists are virtue signaling, and then they do the virtue signaling. He continues on his rant, and he gives a heavy emphasis that children are messed up these days simply because their parents aren't married. Let me tell you, if my parents had stayed married, I would somehow be more messed up because my dad is a bastard that I will also meet in hell with a baseball bat and bear spray. Sometimes parents staying together is not what's best for the children, especially if one of those parents are a general bastard and menace to society. Also, the reason kids are messed up is because child abuse is rampant and not taken seriously under any circumstance, because children are the most oppressed class in the world. But conservatives don't like it when you remind them that children are complex human beings and not possessions. I promise this is the one where I'm going to read the quotes the most, because this was the most flabbergasting section. The next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. They directly said that they want to completely erase queer people from just being acknowledged in any laws or any regulations whatsoever. Not even that, but women's reproductive rights as well. The hypocrisy of that particular passage was so overwhelming, I had to put my phone down, get some water, before I punched a hole in the drywall. He is basically saying that women's reproductive rights and queer people existing is a threat to their First Amendment rights, as if them erasing these things or erasing the ability to speak about these things in law is not violating the First Amendment rights. You saying that queer people should be erased from the government entirely due to their expression, due to their speech, that is a First Amendment right violation. You see, conservatives believe that the Christians' right to Christian totalitarianism is what the First Amendment means. And that's not what the First Amendment means, but that's how they've come to interpret it. They've come to the conclusion that the First Amendment right means freedom of expression and speech for me, but not for thee. Pornography, manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children, for instance, is not a political Gordian knot inextricably binding up disparate claims about free speech, property rights, sexual liberation, and child welfare. It has no claim to First Amendment protection. Its purveyors are child predators and misogynistic exploiters of women. Their product is as addictive as any illicit drug and as psychologically destructive as any crime. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce and distribute it should be imprisoned. Educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classed as registered sex offenders. And telecommunications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shuttered. I warned you. I fucking warned you. How many years ago did I warn you? Is it 3 years that I warned you now? 3 years ago? I was merely 20 years old when I warned you that this would happen. You cannot give the government the power to decide whether or not pornography should be legal or not, especially not the United States government, because they are not doing it because they care about women and children. Let it be known, they do not give a fuck about women and children, especially because based on what they've described here, they believe sex workers should be jailed. They do not give a fuck about women and children, and they never have, considering all they do is push patriarchal standards. What they are going to do with this is they are going to use this as a loophole to jail and maybe even execute queer people. They want to outlaw porn so they can define porn as being queer in an outwardly non-sexual way so they can prosecute queer people for existing. But Nicholas, that is so far-fetched. Every time I warn you of something, it happens. I don't enjoy saying I told you so. I wish I wasn't right about this. Instead of targeting sex traffickers and large porn industry giants, they are just going to target sex workers. You do understand that, right? Like, this is not a W for women. They're just going to arrest sex workers. Sex workers, queer people, all the people that aren't the problem when it comes to porn addiction and the immoral things that happen in the porn industry. Anyways, he goes on a small rant next about how schools should serve the parents and that parents should be children's primary educators, which, I mean, I don't know what I expect from conservatives that think parents are, the owners of children, as if children are not complex human beings, but rather possessions. Color me shocked, I guess. I don't know. He then went on a rant about gender ideology and critical race theory being taught in school, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. We all know this. He then celebrated the overturning of Roe versus Wade and said, and quote, "In particular, the next conservative president should work with Congress to enact the most robust protections for the unborn that Congress will support while deploying existing federal powers to protect innocent life and vigorously complying with statutory bans on the federal funding of abortion." Interesting how they want the unborn to have more protections than the living. They want the unborn to have more protections than women and queer people. And as soon as that unborn is born and is gay, then all bets are off. We are finally on to promise number 2, dismantling the administrative state. Basically, if I were to describe this passage in one sentence, he is ranting about wanting smaller government and wanting the government to be less corrupt. As an anarchist, on a vague level, I agree with these stances, but I know better than to trust a conservative because they have entirely different motivations for these, and they're usually fibbing about wanting to have smaller government. They want big government to, execute and jail queer people, but they want small government in a financial way, or so they claim. It's all I want small government and less taxes, until I say, okay, then defund the military, who we pour like $800 billion into each year, and then all of a sudden, I'm the bad guy. But we'll come back to this later. He then goes on to describe how the federal spending bill process is suspicious and corrupt, and he describes how Congress and Senate have found a loophole to give their administrative unelected staff power via, writing vague laws to write the power over to them, and how that's, corrupt, which I agree with, but we never have the same motivations for agreeing. So it's a very small W that lasts for like 3 seconds. And by last for 3 seconds, I mean in the very next bullet points, he ruins our concurrence by going on another rant about how the administrative staff is the reason for wokeism and transgenderism. He completely ruined everything we could have had in our small 3 seconds of agreeance. Oh, wow. In the same section, this motherfucker complains about federal spending. He then says that he wants a more robust military. Finally, the president can restore public confidence and accountability to our most important government function of all, national defense. My brother in Christ, where do you think the taxes are going? I need you to be so for real right now. We move on to promise number 3. Defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. In this one, he just complains about economic globalization. At one point, he says, today, nearly every top-tier U.S. university president or Wall Street hedge fund manager has more in common with a socialist European head of state than with the parents at a high school football game in Waco, Texas. Which is a batshit crazy thing to say, because he literally was the president of a college. I think conservatives thinking that anyone with power, any elites in the United States, are even close to being socialists or communists is so funny to me. Nobody in power wants to give up that power under socialism and communism. People with money are usually not socialists or communists. I'm going to be so for real with you right now. Any high-profile socialists or communists are not allowed to live as deemed by the FBI. So I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. If you met a real communist, you would shit yourself. He then goes on to complain about open borders policy, which I'm an anarchist, so, a people known for not respecting the concept of a nation state or borders, so all I'm going to say to that is lol sucks to suck. He then calls climate activism climate extremism and says, and I quote, abandoning confidence in human resilience and creativity in responding to the challenges of the future would raise impediments to the most meaningful human activities. My brother in Christ, it was 60 degrees on Christmas in the Midwest. You can endure some fucking impediments to ensure we all won't die. He then goes on a really long rant about how China bad, and how it's bad that we're outsourcing jobs to China, how China is stealing American data. No comment. And then finally, we're on to promise number 4. Secure our God-given individual right to enjoy the blessings of liberty. This section was really weird. Weirder than the last one, so that really says something. It was basically like a rant about how we should protect Americans' rights to the pursuit of happiness so that we can flourish. But really, it seemed like this was just a gateway to have another rant about how communism bad. I need to read this quote because I'm still flabbergasted that this made it in there. Left to our own devices, the American people rejected European monarchy and colonialism, just as we rejected slavery, second-class citizenship for women, mercantilism, socialism, Wilsonian globalism, fascism, communism, and today, wokeism. You, as conservatives, did nothing to abolish slavery and give rights to women. If slavery were still a thing in 2024 and women still couldn't open a credit card in their names in 2024, you guys would be all for that shit. You guys were the reason it happened in the first place. So you taking credit for women's suffrage and for abolishing slavery is batshit insane. I feel like this section I read more quotes again because it's also just as flabbergasting as the first section. We see the same corruption expressed on an individual level whenever billionaire climate activists who want to outlaw carbon-fueled transportation fly to A-list conferences on their private jets, or when COVID-19 shut down politicians like former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and California Governor Gavin Newsom were caught at the hair salon or dining at fancy restaurants after moralizing about how everyone else must stay home and forego such luxuries during the pandemic. For socialists, who are almost always well-to-do, socialism is not a means of equalizing outcomes, but a means of accumulating power. They never get around to helping anyone else. I have my own gripes about state socialists. You know, real state socialists, real state communists. But calling Nancy Pelosi a socialist is... I'm at a loss for words. Quick reminder to conservatives that liberals are not socialists and they are moderate to center right. There is no leftist wing in the United States. That does not exist. There is nobody in power that is truly leftist. There is not a powerful leftist party. I'd say for a grand majority of this, you are complaining about liberalism, which I'm not too fond of liberalism either, but that doesn't mean I like you. What you are describing is not a leftism thing. It is a power thing, which conservatives also demonstrate, mind you. It's almost as if we should abolish power hierarchies so that this doesn't happen. It's almost as if we shouldn't allow people to be able to seek positions of power like that. Any real leftist wants Nancy Pelosi's head on a pike. This entire section was about like pro-growth economic policy and how they want to engage in less state capitalism, which they think is socialism. I will give him 1 point for acknowledging capitalist corruption, where he says it enables America's largest corporations to profit through political influence rather than competitive enterprise and customer satisfaction. This is a minor W, but also I don't trust conservatives to have the same motivations as me, especially because the motivation at the end there was entirely capitalist. So, and also I don't trust them to not be hypocrites about that, because tax policy that he vaguely touched on earlier in the passage probably includes tax breaks for billionaires. So the last section is a conclusion paragraph that acts as a call to action. He, in desperation, says that they have 2 years to get this right, and furthers his oppression complex that he thinks is real. At this point, we're at only like page 50 of 920. I think the reason why we should actually be scared is because he does actually reference a time in history where they did this. They did a mandate for leadership. Reagan became president, and then according to him, 60% of the policies were in fact implemented. 60% of any of these policies would be devastating. 25% of these policies would be devastating. If you want me to do another part or several parts of this, going through the rest of the document and pointing out the more important and harrowing parts of it, I can certainly do so. But I think the foreword is pretty damning in itself. I'm not too happy about the things that are transpiring around me.